Welcome once again to our study of Journey Without Goal, the Tantric Wisdom of the Buddha. And as always, kindly generate the intention of bodhicitta, which is recognizing how all sentient beings, without having in the ground of their nature anything confused or undesirable or dislikable, then sentient beings, on the basis of their delusion, they get entangled in actions that drive their own suffering and drive the suffering of others. And as such, we have the situation of the endless realms of samsara. And this study that we're undertaking here is not about satisfying our sort of wish for something intellectually satisfying, something profound and amazing. It's really because we wish to help every sentient being become free. And so the teaching that we're studying here is intended to be a vehicle for transformation of our present mind, which separates sentient beings into beings that we like, sentient beings that we dislike. And in general, we operate from a confused perspective of just ourselves. And with the practice of the path, the objective is really to extend beyond just this self-centering into a freedom where we're no longer bound by this confused misunderstanding of the nature of our reality. And so we do this on the path through cultivating the three prajnas, the prajna through hearing, the prajna through reflecting on the teaching and owning it in terms of our personal experience, and then the practice of the prajna of engaging this as a lived experience through the prajna of meditation. So engaging with this, you could say, magnanimous, courageous, vast attitude, then we'll look at the text itself. And we'll begin with today I managed to not forget this. So we'll begin with the what's it called, intensifying devotion in one's heart, crying to the gurus from afar, where we're then invoking our forefathers, the lineage masters, and we're presently invoking the masters of the Shangpa Kagyu. And the Shangpa Kagyu, despite being called the Kagyu lineage, is actually, well, it's a Kagyu lineage in the sense that it upholds the teachings that come down from Vajrayana and the teachings such as the six yogas and so forth. But it's a little bit different from the Kagyu lineage that's associated with the lineage of Mapa, Mila, and Gambopa. So in this case, the main person actually is somebody called Trungpa Naljor. Now, as we look in the footnote here, I just looked at it before, and it actually said something I did not know. So it says here, the Shangpa Kagyu is a sect of the Kagyu lineage founded by Barapa Gyaltsen Palsang from the 14th century. However, it traces its origins back to Shang Trungpa Naljor, a follower Pern who converted to Buddhism. He had many Indian gurus, one of them being Niguma, Naropa's wife and disciple. So the Shangpa Kagyu apparently is founded by this person in the 14th century, but really when we talk about the Shangpa Kagyu, we generally trace its origins back to, we talk about and think of well, as I understood it, in terms of Trungpa Naljor. And so Trungpa Naljor, like it said, he was somebody immensely learned at a very young age. He traveled to Nepal and then to India. And in India, he asked around who was the greatest teacher and who had received teachings directly from the Buddha Vajradhara. And he was directed to Niguma, a female Siddha who he studied with them. Initially, she tried to scare him off and so forth, but he persisted, and she then granted him the teachings such as the 6 yogas and what is known as the Vajra verses and so forth. And he then brought these teachings back with him to Tibet, where these teachings then spread. And essentially the teachings such as the 6 yogas correspond to those that we also have from Naropa, but then again they are coming down from female Siddha. This is also something that often is understood as to be what is practiced by women. So the Shampa-Kagyu lineage then had a lot of great masters, and including actually, as we shall see, Tangtong Gyalpo, and also down to the present day Jaren Khyentse Wangpo. In the Tsangka there you see Jaren Khyentse Wangpo and Jamgon Kongtrul, and also then Kala Rinpoche. Down at the very bottom you see someone with a mustache, and that's actually the late Kala Rinpoche. So this is the Shampa-Kagyu lineage, Tanka here, and Kongtrul Lodrotai then in these verses writes, "Incomparable Shampa-Kagyu, think of me. Look upon me from the completely pure Buddha land. Help me to learn properly the practice that liberates through skillful means and attain the unity of non-learning." The next then is Tangtong Gyalpo, who actually figures in the lineage tree here in this Tanka just below Khyumphon Naljor. But many of you will be familiar with Tangtong Gyalpo as someone whose life as a siddha unfolded in terms of being a tremendously accomplished engineer. It's said that he built something like, some say 58, some say 108 bridges in Tibet and in Bhutan, some of which are still standing. And if you go to Bhutan, there's not so far from Paro, I forget the name of the place, there's one of his bridges that are still standing there, and you can see these enormous big iron chains that Tangtong Gyalpo used to build these bridges, and this is all iron that was offered by the Nagas, and the amount of iron that would have gone into these is enormous, and the narrative speaks about how all this iron ore was offered by the Nagas. Moreover, he also traveled and taught widely. He was a treasure revealer. He was a holder of the Shampa-Kagyu lineage, and also he was seen as an emanation of Padmasambhava. There's a lot of teachings that come down from Tangtong Gyalpo as treasure teachings that came from Padmasambhava. And also one of his consorts was Samding Dorje Pamo, who is one of the famous incarnation lineages of women in Tibet. Her monastery still stands at the Lake Yamdrok in central Tibet, and we still have an incarnation lineage of her. And he was actually the one who established this lineage on the basis of recognizing the reincarnation. Tangtong Gyalpo lived for a very long time, and he is then associated with, of course, a lot of benefiting sentient beings. He's also associated with being the father of Tibetan opera, something called flamo, which is a theater. And this was originally devised because when he was building these bridges, simply just to entertain the crowds at night and bring their minds to Dharma, all the people working on the bridges, Tangtong Gyalpo devised these entertainment, these spectacles. So that became the basis of Tibetan theater. And to this day, actually, I think his theater pieces are still being performed. So anyway, we invoke him as a great Siddha. It says, Jamgon Kongtrul writes, "Great Siddha Tangtong Gyalpo, think of me. Look upon me from the realm of effortless compassion. Help me to practice the yogic action of realizing insubstantiality. Help me to master prana and mind." So, and then we'll go to the, actually, let's see here. It seems to be the case that, let's see here. Transmission, right? So we looked a little bit about the foundations for transmission, and about being real. in terms of recognizing that what we are practicing has to do with us. So we're not engaging in some far out beautiful tradition, but it's continually about us coming back to what we actually are. And that's where there's a little bit of a potential danger, like Trungpa Rinpoche identifies, how sometimes from the foreigner's perspective, and those coming from non-Buddhist cultures, the cultures of modernity or Westerners, we could say, that they project onto the Buddhist lineages all sorts of expectations and naive projections, and also from the side of the Asian teachers, those who come from traditional Buddhist societies, also meeting this sort of enthusiasm, then just sort of going along and giving these foreigners whatever they like without really sort of being discerning about what they actually need. And so let's see here. So that's where there's a potential for this, you could say, the teaching being somewhat lost in translation. The situation of transmission needs to be based on a very real sense of this, the universal nature of neurosis and the need for dealing with neurosis and assisting the students in transforming into, you could say, or freeing the students from their limitations. So that whole process of transforming individuals can't really be done on the basis of both parties sort of misunderstanding each other. Of course, this is where, again, Trungpa Rinpoche and other of the teachers that we have in the modern world have done a remarkable job in terms of actually transcending these cultural barriers. Trungpa Rinpoche here says, so, well, actually going back a little bit, Trungpa Rinpoche says, all human beings have the same psychology. They think in the same way. They have the same requirements as students. The question is simply how one can teach students no matter, the question is simply how one can teach students no matter where they come from. In that respect, he then says, we can follow the example of the Buddha, who presented the teachings to the Indians of his time in a universal fashion. It's much more enlightened to view the world as one global situation. Everybody is united. We're all samsaric people, and we all have the potential to become enlightened as well. We do not have to be particularly kind towards one part of the world or another, or for that matter, aggressive towards one part of the world or another. We are one world. We share one earth, one water, one fire, and one sun. So this is where, when we're talking about everybody being the same and universal and so on, we could say, well, you know, Danes are in one particular way, you know, the Kiwis are in one particular way, the Aussies, the Americans, you know, the Germans, the Brits, you know, the French, and so forth, right? So we could say, oh, people are so different, but there's a basic place where everyone is the same, really. The notion of pride, you know, wounded egos, the notion of ambitious egos, the notion of pleasure-seeking egos, aggressive, ignorant, dull. These, which lie at the very ground of what we perhaps could identify as sort of cultural expressions, these they lie as universals. So that's where, as far as the illness that needs to be treated, that's the same all across the various cultures. So that's where we need to recognize also when we're talking about persons like Tangtong Gyalpo, of course, was a little bit sort of, his lifestyle was perhaps somewhat difficult to identify with in terms of him being somewhat a siddha right from the birth. But for example, then in the case of Khyentse Neljo and other great masters, we look at individuals who actually worked with their neurosis and overcame confusion. So as such, then, as we look down through the history of Buddhist transmission, there is a universal project that has been undertaken by everyone. And that's a project that has nothing to do with the particularities of culture. Trungpa Rinpoche continues then, wherever a student comes from, his or her attitude is very important. To receive transmission, a student should be humble and open, but not wretched. Being humble in this case is like being a teacup. If we're pouring a cup of tea, the cup could be said to be humble. The cup has a sense of being in its own place. When we pour tea into a cup, the cup is at a lower level and the pot is at a higher level. This has nothing to do with spiritual trips, higher consciousness, lower consciousness, or anything like that. We're talking pragmatically. If we're going to pour tea into a cup, the cup obviously should be lower than a pot. Otherwise, we would be unable to pour anything into it. So I don't think there's any explanation is needed. No commentary is needed for that. So Trungpa Rinpoche continues, the water obviously has to flow down. It is very simple. Like a humble cup, the student should feel fertile and at the same time open. Because tea is going to be poured into this particular cup. The cup has a sense of open expectation. Why not? We are no longer wretched people who are not up to the level of receiving teaching. We're simply students who want to know, who want to learn and receive instructions. Also, one cup is not necessarily or more valuable than another. It could be made out of many things, ordinary clay, porcelain, gold, or silver. But it is still a cup as long as it can hold water or tea. So obviously, this is where we are no longer, don't have to see ourselves as being final in one way. As students, it means we're no longer defined as being, I am like this or I am like that. As students, we understand that we are ever changing, and being then on the path, we're ever changing towards enlightenment. So we're continually improving. We're no longer stuck in being one way or another. And so that's where there's a very real sense of being a recipient. And this, however, this being a recipient is not really a matter of being in a hierarchical situation. It's simply just a matter of being open and present and able to hold what is being transmitted, to hold the tea. Trungpa Rinpoche says, to be a proper cup, we should be free from spiritual materialism, thoroughly ripened and brought to spiritual maturity so that transmission can take place. Then in our basic being, we feel the quality of cupness. We feel our whole existence thirsting to receive teachings. We are open to the teachings. That is the first step in transmission. Like the cup, we are on a certain level of experience that is not absolutely wretched or full of holes. We don't feel that we are deprived. In fact, being a cup is an absolutely powerful thing. There is a sense of pride. Because our cup has such a strong quality of cupness, the teapot cannot help but fill it with knowledge or teachings. The teacher cannot wait to pour into us. We are seducing the teapot with our cupness, our pride, our self-existence, and our sanity. Two magnetic processes are taking place. The cup is magnetized by the teapot, and the teapot is equally magnetized by the cup. A love affection takes place. Just something comes to mind. You know, we very often, in the discussion of transmission, we talk about the need for devotion, which is actually what we're talking about here, the openness. And it's on the basis of this openness that something can take place. And devotion really allows for something to take place which goes beyond just, you could say, sheer rationality, sheer working with cause and effect. It's actually being sensitive to that which is entirely beyond cause and effect, the unconditional or the co-emergent. So devotion to the teacher is very often stressed, but this is what Trungpa Rinpoche is talking about here, is also the teacher's devotion to the student, because that's actually even greater in some sense, that it's entirely unconditional. The teacher, and we're talking about a genuine teacher, not just, you could say, what we might think of as an ordinary teacher, but here an enlightened teacher is entirely, a bodhisattva is entirely committed to the student. So there is a commitment, and you could say, like Trungpa talks about here, the teapot is seduced by the cup. There's actually a devotion to the student, and this is something also that's important to think about. Not just that we are students who have to be devoted to some teacher who might actually sort of be, how do you say, just sitting up there in their high place. That's not at all the case. The very nature of this transmission is that the teacher, first of all, doesn't think in dualistic terms of being me and my student. It's more like, you could say, water that just flows to where, you could say, where there's a, when you pour water out, then it will just flow naturally to, where gravity takes it and so forth. Then similarly, also without any ambition or plan, the teacher does naturally benefits the student in however is needed. But it comes from this place, this unconditional place of, you could say, devotion to the student, commitment, or we would actually more talk about this in terms of compassion. But you can see there is this dual, this twofold aspect of meeting of two persons, two minds. Transmission means, Trungpa continues then, transmission means the extension of spiritual wakefulness from one person to someone else. Wakefulness is extended rather than transferred. The teacher or the transmitter extends his or her own inspiration rather than giving his or her experience away to somebody else and becoming an empty balloon. The teacher is generating wakefulness and inspiration constantly without ever being depleted. So for the student, transmission is like being charged with electricity. So that's also where there's not really the notion that the teacher is going to be, you'd say, exhausted by teaching students. That's the very nature of the bodhisattva. I remember once asking Tugu Penwanggyal about, aren't we tiring the teachers? And he just said they could have just stayed where they were, meaning the Dharmakaya, the state of the unconditional absolute nature. But here they are, they have taken birth into this world. They're bodhisattvas. There's no chance of them actually being depleted. Transmission also requires the dynamic expression of the student's own emotions. As students, our aggression, our lust, and our stupidity are all included. According to the Vajrayana, everything we can think of, including the emotions, is workable. In fact, transmission cannot take place without emotions because they're part of the food of transmutation. And since they are so energetic and powerful, we do not want to exclude any of them. As long as we separate our philosophy and our concepts of morality from our emotions, there is no problem. This does not mean we should be completely loose, seemingly free from philosophy, morality, and ethics, but that self-existing ethics can takes place. This does not mean that we should be completely loose, seemingly free from philosophy, morality, and ethics, but that self-existing ethics take place constantly. To receive transmission, it's absolutely necessary to be an ordinary human being, confused, stupid, lustful, and angry. Without those emotional qualities, we cannot receive transmission. They are absolutely necessary. I do not think this is a particularly difficult requirement to fulfill. Everybody seems to have a pretty juicy helping of them. So what we're saying here is that we obviously need to be completely honest with what we are. We don't need to dress up or pretend to be in one way or another. This, of course, doesn't mean also that we have to be sort of proud of being in one way. I'm very interesting in my particular style of neurosis. I'm very arrogant, and then having some sense of this is how I am, and there's not really a sense that I'm going to be changing. So that's where that could be problematic. But there's also this sense that we sometimes think, oh yeah, according to philosophy, I should be not held by my base instincts, and according to my philosophy, I should be in one way or another. Philosophy, morality, ethics, and so on seem to sometimes direct us and contrive us in that particular way. So what we're suggesting here is that there's a place where we need to open up with quite simply exposing what we are. And this is something that then becomes the basis for a very real process of working with who we are rather than what we should be. So this is basic to the journey, and we all seem to have this, we all seem to have a juicy helping of neurosis. Kleshas. Trungpa Rinpoche says, our emotions are regarded as the wiring or electrical circuit that receives transmission. We could say that we have three wires, one for passion, one for aggression, and one for naivete or ignorance or slothfulness. These three form a very busy electrical device that would like to receive transmission. We're hungry for it. We're dying for it. And on the other side, there is the electrical generator, which is somewhat smug, knowing that it's ready to transmit at any time. So here we're talking about the basic condition that constructs us in terms of kleshas, which is essentially attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And it's that which keeps us busy saying, this is me, this is how I am. And that's where we're continually having a very vivid and real experience of being who we are, but we also have a very vivid experience of suffering. And so if we're sufficiently sensitive, then we're interested in becoming free of this suffering. And that's then where we have the situation that something could be done about it, and there's somebody who holds the answer. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, so we have a good machine and we're beautifully wired. Now we're just waiting for the generator to convey the charge, which in Sanskrit is called abhisheka. Abhisheka literally means sprinkling or bathing or anointment. It is the formal ceremony or empowerment, a formal transmission from teacher to student. Abhisheka cannot take place unless the necessary wiring has already been set up. And to change our analogy slightly, Abhisheka cannot take place without a good electrician, the teacher or guru, who will know when to switch on the current. So Abhisheka is what we refer to as empowerment, and we sometimes refer to it also as initiation. Now, personally, I've never really liked the word initiation, because it sort of gives a sense of a lodge where you're sort of, you become a member and you become part of a secret society, and you have, the handshake and what have you. So there's some sense of exclusiveness that can be a little bit confusing. Of course, initiation works, and some translators, and even very good translators, will use the word initiation. But I always think empowerment, and the Tibetan word wong, abhisheka, means to, to authorize or formally acknowledge the value of a person. So you could say like, and this is where we then can say anointment, bathing, sprinkling, and so forth. Like when the queen is given the orb and scepter, and when we, for example, might receive an appointment of one kind or another, they're seeing our potential. So there's these connotations with the word abhisheka. Trungpa Rinpoche says, in abhisheka, there is a sense of destruction, a sense of flow, and a sense of fulfillment. Those three principles of abhisheka are analogous to electricity in many ways. When we turn on a switch, the first thing that happens is that the resistance to the current is destroyed. Then the current can flow through the circuit. And finally, the electricity can fulfill its purpose. If we turn on a lamp, first the electrical resistance is destroyed by turning on the switch. Then the electricity flows, and finally the lamp is lit. In the same way, the Abhisheka, in receiving Abhisheka, destruction comes first, right at the beginning. Anything that is disorganized or confused, or any misconceptions about receiving Abhisheka, gets destroyed on the spot, immediately. According to Tantric tradition, it's better not to get into Tantra, but if we must get into it, we had better surrender. Having surrendered, we must give up the idea of survival. Survival means that we can still play our games, play our little tricks on the world. We have our usual routines, the little gadgets that we play with, the little colors that we pull out of our personality to make sure that we exist. But in Tantra, it's not possible to play any games. So at the beginning, it's necessary to give in completely. We have to surrender our groundlessness. There's no ground for us to develop security. As well, we surrender to the fact that we cannot hold on to our ego, which by innuendo means that we surrender to the enlightened state of being. Then actually, we do not have to do anything. Once we open, we just open. So we see this, of course, here with the analogy of electricity. We also have it in those who practice sadhana and so forth. You'll know that there's always a preliminary path where you actually need to expel. The obstructing forces, and this, of course, also applies then when we receive empowerment. And the obstructing forces here are then the little sort of, there's a place where we, on our journey, we'd like to reserve this sort of the sense of, this is my interesting identity. I am in this particular way. We sort of engage in society, and people know, oh, you know, this is Jakob, and he has this very interesting, you know, he's so one way or another, and we kind of maintain that, and that becomes very often what we actually stick to in terms of our reference point. This is my interesting personality. You know, I'm so-so. I'm a Libra. I'm a Sagittarius. I have this terrible trait. Ha ha ha. And so we sort of perpetuate a sort of little mythology around who we are, and we actually don't really want to go into this place of groundlessness. We would actually want to stay with these sort of familiar reference points. And that's where actually we remain then addicted to our little sort of, we might be sort of committed externally to the path, and we might say, I'm a Buddhist, I'm this, that, and the other, but we'd still actually like to reserve a little place where our ego can get what we want. And sort of the notion of groundlessness, where we don't really have any particular reference point as such, any something to hold on to reassure us with our insecurity, that's a little bit counter to the way that our ego normally runs the show. And so this is where we need to actually be willing to surrender. Of course, we need to initially have the trust in the teacher, the teaching, and so forth. But for this actually to work, and for the whole transmission to actually take place, there actually has to be this willingness to relinquish and to surrender. So this does not mean anything extraordinary, really. It's a very simple thing that we do when there's trust taking place, but it is absolutely necessary. Then Trungpa just says here, all that is part of the first principle of Abhisheka, destruction. When that first level of Abhisheka takes place, it kills any unnecessary germs in our system. At that point, we have no hopes of manipulating anything at all. Then the flow of energy can take place. And after that, there is fulfillment. We finally begin to see the reality of what is possible in tantric experience. It's necessary for anyone involved with the discipline of Vajrayana to understand the three principles of destruction, flow, and fulfillment. I'm glad we could discuss these principles publicly so that you will have a chance either to prepare yourselves or to run away. That creates a very open situation. And of course, also, this is what we do with the practice of Nundro. When we're talking about getting free of all the germs, this is what we do with purification. And we're also doing this in terms of the accumulation of merit, and so on. We're creating very real conditions for this transmission, the flow of energy to take place, which is then what Guru Yoga facilitates. But of course, we need to realize that there is a very real dimension of us having to relinquish our, you could say, addiction to what in fact normally sort of constitutes really the toxic nature of our addiction or habituation, the sort of familiar misery that is samsara. And so there has to be a place where we're willing to cut and to throw out confusion. So this is where actually in so much of the Vajrayana problems that we have in the modern world comes from this sort of that there's a sense of, I would really want to get into it, but then once we're in it, then it's not at all according to what we expect, and then there's frustration. So that's where it's very useful to, before we engage in the spiritual path, and we can talk about this as Vajrayana, but it might be universal to spirituality in general, that for genuine spirituality to emerge, it is about relinquishing the familiar. So we should know from the start that there's something taking place here which is beyond the sort of ordinary linear notion of education or process that we've been educated to sort of to assume is how the journey might unfold. Trungpa says, the student always has a chance to run away. We seem to have the concept that tantric discipline imposes itself on us. But what we're discussing is entirely self-imposed. The student might freak out at any time. He or she might feel weighted down, over clean and overfilled. But in order to receive transmission, he has to stay in his own place, which is not particularly pleasurable. That's right. Yes. So we might sort of reject the notion that we want to be transformed, and of course we're welcome to stay untransformed. But the problem is us staying in our little self-imposed prison is not that much fun. Samsara is just not fun. And what we effectively are talking about with transmission is essentially a teacher handing over to us our own individual wisdom. We've always possessed this. We're not going to become carbon copies of the teacher or become little soldiers in the army of the Buddha. We're going to be set free with our own particularly unique original style of awakening, but that requires, and that's where the teacher's wisdom is needed. That requires a sort of what do you call when you have your eye cut? You know, the cataract. You know, when you have a cataract removed, yeah, you need to go through an operation. You have to have the cataract removed. So there's something that needs to actually take place, and that's where the teacher is really just handing us over what the wisdom we were born with, so to speak, the co-emergent wisdom. But that does constitute a process, and that does constitute actually the teacher, if we're open to it, empowering us to see a vision that far extends what we've ordinarily been imagining. Anyway, like Trungpa says here, it's up to us. We have the chance. We're free to run away if we want. Trungpa then says, to conclude, the role of the guru in transmission is to electrify the student's vessel so that it becomes clean and clear, free of all kinds of materialistic germs, and then to pour the essence into it. And if he is to be electrified at all, to be cleaned out and filled up, the student must be waiting and ready. He has to be willing to be made into a good vessel. As a good vessel, the student feels that he or she is opening and taking part constantly. And as a good vessel, he could hold all sorts of heavy-handed liquids. In a good vessel, we could drink alcoholic beverages, we could drink up dualistic thoughts. We could drink the blood of ego, who is killed on the spot. And so this image of vessel is really universal. Again, coming back to the Nundro, we would say that for the teacher to pour the nectar into the vessel of the students, the vessel has to be cleaned and has to be ready. And this is then what is accommodated with the practice of the preliminary practices. So that's where then we arrive at the situation where transmission could take place. Next, we're going to be looking at the Vajra Master, the one from whom we then receive transmission. Let's see if there's some questions. It is frequent nowadays that the teacher gives the Abhisheka without knowing the students well enough to assess if they're ready for it. Is that still a valid Abhisheka? Yeah, there's a few things to be said about that. To some extent, we could say that while Buddhism in India evolved in a multicultural setting, and for that reason was actually kept secret, because the Vajrayana, I mean, did I say Buddhism in India? I mean Vajrayana Buddhism, Tantra in India was because it was a multicultural setting, easily prone to misunderstanding. It was kept secret Mantrayana and all of that. In Tibet, however, then Tibet was very much, you could say, a monoculture in the sense that both the original Burn tradition, and the Vajrayana Buddhism and Buddhism in general, they all sort of agreed in the basic outlook, in the basic tenets. And as such, there wasn't really any need for secrecy. And so Abhisheka was regarded as something that could be shared with anyone at any time. Well, not like that, but it wasn't prone to a culture of secrecy as such. And so receiving Abhisheka was always, for all Tibetans, it was seen as a wonderful thing to partake in. People would crowd in whenever and to this day, crowd in whenever there's an opportunity to receive an Abhisheka. But there so that's where we have that spilling into the modern world, because then again, we have this, a little bit like Trungpa was talking about this, there seems to be a modern audience that's also very excited to receive Abhisheka. Of course, this is where, and this is the discussion we've just had in this chapter, it's questionable whether the students necessarily are ready and whether the teacher actually has assessed the students, you could say, assess the qualifications. Now, that being said, then there is also another way, and this also comes from the Tibetan culture, is that we could receive Abhisheka as a blessing. So on one hand, we could receive Abhisheka as part of our spiritual journey, having completed the necessary requirements, the preliminaries, if you like. Then we receive Abhisheka, which then is where we engage in the actual Vajrayana journey. That's Abhisheka for what it should be understood. But again, coming from the context of Tibet, where Abhisheka was given to an audience that was so appreciative, there's the notion that Abhisheka could then just be given as a blessing. And that would mean that people who were there, who weren't necessarily going to practice it, or would only practice it in a very superficial sense, that's fine too, just because it's something very uplifting and it creates wonderful conditions for the further, for their whatever, for their, creates wonderful conditions for those who receive it. So that's where we could say that when the teacher gives Abhisheka without knowing the students, then we could say the teacher is actually giving it just as a blessing. Yeah. But you would also see then there are, and also this happens nowadays, teachers who would be quite strict in saying, I'm going to give this empowerment just to the teachers or students who are ready for it. Then there's another question. Since the tantric teachings suggest that it's better not to get into tantra, I don't think it said that, but anyway, how can we decide whether to get into it or not? Well, the teachings, what is being given here is just you could say, an understanding of tantra and how it actually requires complete surrender. And so that's where we might say, well, I like to call myself a Buddhist, and I have Buddhist drapings in my house, and I like to, Buddhist things, Buddha statues. I have Buddha statues in my garden, and I call myself a Buddhist. And I like the idea of compassion and non-aggression, but we might not. So we might actually, you could say, have Buddhism as sort of something that we sort of add to our interesting personality. But the actual notion of venturing into the complete relinquishing of ignorance and the relinquishing of ego, that might be beyond what many people would like. And that's why there's a sense that we should know what we're getting into. We're getting into something incredibly valuable, but it requires our complete commitment. So here we're not suggesting that it's better not to get into Tantra, but we are suggesting that it's very important to know what it's all about. Yeah. So that's where it's up to us, and that's where we have the situation of the Nindra. We can just practice the Nindra, and we can study the teaching, and we'll find out if this is for us. That's entirely legitimate. The person says, to me it feels that I should know, but how can you know? Do you just trust your instinct? Well, yes, we can trust our instinct. Then again, our instinct would need, you could say, honing or education. That's where, I would say, not to worry. Nobody's gotten, I can tell you, nobody's gotten in that deep. So we're all in a place where we're learning about the path. This is also an early days in the transmission of Buddhism into the so-called modern world. So I think we'll have plenty of time to assess the value of the path. But as someone who's been doing this for most of my life, I would like to, as a salesperson, says, don't worry, it's okay, it's good. So, but of course, you should be critical and not take my word for it. Can you explain how our emotions are essential for transformation, and yet we need to destroy our emotional habitual supports of our ego before we can engage in the flow? Yes, the emotions are our energy, and right now our energy is sadly filtered through our insecurity, the insecurity of our ego, the insecurity of our hopes and fears. So it's true, we are about to destroy our the supports of our ego, in the sense that we're supporting our own pettiness, our own smallness. And that's where we're going to be setting, if you like, you could say, setting emotions free is to discover wisdom. So we need to work with what we are, who we are, and so forth. We can't have a compartmentalized journey where we have our emotions here, and then we have our sort of Buddhist, our awakened persona over here. It's one and the same thing. And so all we're doing is removing the filters, the confused projections about our emotions. But we need to be honest, just like if we go up to the doctor and say, I'm having this issue here, then when we become cured of the illness, then it's a bit like being cured of an illness that doesn't come back. If we've had hepatitis A, then if we had that one time, then we're not going to get it again, supposedly. So that's where it's very helpful for us to be completely that it's absolutely essential for our transformation that we are clear on what we contain, but at the same time also we shouldn't sort of again be holding on to it, saying this is who I am, and by the way, it's very interesting, this is what I am right now. Is neither good nor bad, but it is filtered through my neurosis, and through working with my existing conditions, then it will, we know that it's something that could be far greater. In order to receive transmission, the student has to stay in his own place, which is not particularly pleasurable. What does Chögyam Trungpa mean here? Is that what he said? Yeah, let's just say, in order to receive the transmission, the student has to stay in his own place. Wow, let me just find it. But in order to receive, has to stay in his place, which is not particularly. I think it comes back to what we were just talking about. To receive transmission, the student has to be willing to acknowledge the existing condition of neurosis and the painful nature of that. So to be willing to acknowledge that. That's how I understand it. Yeah. But I can see it's a little bit confusing, isn't it? In order to, he has to stay in it, so not particularly pleasurable. Because staying, well, on that note, it sounds that by definition, his or her own place is not desirable or pleasurable. Could sound as if it's sort of the final word. And I think the implication here is that it's not particularly pleasurable, but at the same time, it's workable. That's how I'm reading it. Yeah, that it's a workable situation. Yeah. Question about the Abhisheka in Tibet. Does that mean that the people crowding up when there's a master giving Abhisheka would be all clean vessels? In some sense, yes, because they come with a lot of faith. So there's a lot of appreciation for what is being received, but there is also, you could say, a little bit of there's a little bit of there's just a joy, and there's a little bit of naivete involved in the sense that this is wonderful. The teacher is giving this empowerment. Let's all, get there and get it, So, here we're talking about the fine points of spiritual materialism and so forth. So you could say, they might not as if perhaps all the criteria for really engaging in the spiritual path, when you have these sort of transmissions of empowerment given to a crowd, all the criteria might not be met. But at the same time, we as outside observers could just say, give them the benefit of the doubt and saying, isn't it wonderful that people are interested in receiving empowerment? But here then we are, certainly when we're looking at ourselves, that's where we would want to be critical in terms of our own, you could say, our own requirements. If students don't have a root guru and haven't met a lama in person to make a connection with them, if students don't have a root guru and haven't met a lama in person to make a connection with them as a teacher, can they cultivate enough devotion through invoking the lineage like we do at the beginning of class, or imagination of teachers past and present to be able to receive transmission and blessing? Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt that it's necessary to actually meet a teacher and to relate to real persons, and the whole discomfort and the whole sort of like falling away of familiar reference points, that is indispensable. But until we engage in that process, there's a lot of value in reading the lives of the teacher, connecting with the culture of the teachers and the lineage and so forth, and invoking the lineage of the teachers and so forth. That's absolutely fine. That's a great place, and this is where everybody begins, So that's almost an indispensable part of the journey. Okay, then it says, then there's another question. Initiation often implies a process that is painful, like a rite of passage. In this correlation, the correlation for the translation of empowerment, because it's destructive. Well, yeah, I mean, here we actually did start off with Trungpa Rinpoche, as he was defining it in terms of destruction, flow, and fulfillment. Then there is, you could say also that is implicit in the term initiation. But initiation almost more focuses on that, like you were saying, a rite of passage, whereas empowerment also very much speaks in terms of flow and particularly fulfillment, right? Trungpa Rinpoche's image of the student as a vessel. Is this why Vajrayana holds a blood-filled skull cup? Well, not really. That's not really, no. The whole image of the vessel is that something is being poured into it. There's transmission taking place. When Vajrayana holds a skull cup, it's basically that she's ingesting the blood of samsara. She's feasting on ignorance. And that's, of course, you could say a particular tantric metaphor for the transmutation of neurotic emotion into wisdom. So this is slightly different. But of course, Trungpa, he is sort of alluding to that when he's saying, you could have a vessel that can hold the tea, it can hold the alcohol, it can hold the whole blood. But that's more still in the discussion of the student as a vessel. And Vajrayani's, the image of Vajrayani's skull cup with blood is slightly different. Would staying in his own place have a sense of personal responsibility about it? Possibly. The only thing that's a little bit puzzling is that it seems to be a prerequisite and a sort of the nature of the journey here, and yet it's being defined as not being particularly pleasurable. Yes, it could have a sense of relating responsibly with one's own neurosis. I guess it could mean that too. Yeah. That's a little bit sort of curious. Anyway, as I often say, I shan't pretend to actually be able to gauge the intention and the wisdom of Trungpa Rinpoche's teaching here in presenting this text. All I'm doing is, we're reading it together, and you are then getting, you could say, my particular reflections on this and the way that I sort of read it. Stay in his own place. Is it not about pretending to be? Is it not about pretending to be not what I am? Possibly, yes. What's a little bit curious is this, that it's defined in terms of being not particularly pleasurable. You could say it is not pleasurable, but it's workable or something like that.
What's it all?
What's it all? Yeah, accepting, ourselves as we are with all our imperfections. But then again, I think the implication here is that something can be done about it. Anyway, yes. All right, it's coming up to 10. There's a few minutes left. I guess I'm not going to start the next chapter. If you don't have any more questions, we can end here. Yeah. Oh, by the way, those of you who are interested, I'm going to be doing a seminar this weekend. It's called the Vajrayana. And it will consist of a talk. This is, of course, all Australian time, that runs from 6:30 Friday night to 8 o'clock, which is about the Vajrayana, also about the history of the Vajrayana. And then the Saturday will be more about Vajrayana, the view and the practice of Vajrayana, and then Sunday more specifically more about Vajrayana practice, sadhana and samaya and so forth. So this will be happening. If you go to the Siddhartha Intent website, si.org.au, you can see about it there. And also, if you're on the mailing list, it would be, you would have received information about this. It will be recorded, yes. Yeah. So, so yes, recordings will take place. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll conclude. Through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. In the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection, may they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.